Today's episode is with Scott Weston.
I try to think of it like a Swiss Army knife for GCP pen testing. So one of them is a wiki. One of the goals of making this tool is to make it community driven and allow people who want to get into GCPwn or know about GCPwn. To me, cloud environments grow big. They don't necessarily get more complex, they just get bigger. Yeah, so the shared responsibility model in cloud is basically like an agreement between you and the cloud provider. There's usually different aspects depending on what you're testing. From a core security perspective, probably networking is the most important because most of the minimum that you consider to be good enough for security should be higher than that's dictated by external regulations, right? There's certain things that are very configuration based per service, and what I mean by that is it's the very end of all this. I like to do a manual, kind of what I talked about earlier. I do a manual check on the individual services. But from like the human element looking at it, you might be like, why are you allowing everyone to download your Lambda code, right? I don't think it matters which one you start with. Personally, I always lean towards AWS. You really just have to understand the core functionality and everything else kind of just clicks into place.
Hi everyone, this is Purushottam and thanks for tuning into Scale to Zero podcast. Today's episode is with Scott Weston. Scott is a senior consultant at cybersecurity consulting company NetSpy. Originally from Southern California, Scott is currently based out of Minneapolis, where he has experience testing AWS GCP web applications, including GraphQL and external networks as well. Under the Webin root alias, he has spoken about AWS at Forward CloudSec 2023, and he has also released a tool this year's Forward CloudSec called GCPwn to assist in pen testing GCP environments. We'll talk about that during the podcast today. And in his spare time, he enjoys doing bug bounties or pursuing other research paths or opportunities. First of all, Scott, thank you so much for taking the time and joining with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we start, do you want to briefly share about your journey? Like, how did you get started? What interested you in security, even pen testing? If you want to share anything.
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in Southern California and I went to college out at Arizona State. And so while I was at Arizona State, I studied computer science, and so that's how I kind of got into computers. Towards the end of my junior or senior year, I tried getting more involved in the hacking clubs on campus. So, shout out to like Shellfish and some of those other teams. And so I ended up finding that I really liked breaking things as opposed to making them. That just I had a better inclination towards that. So that's kind of what I started pursuing. So out of college, I got hired by General Motors. So I worked for General Motors for a year doing application security, moved up to Michigan. And then I got hired by NetSpy shortly after that. I've been at NetSpy for about 3 years. And kind of like you said, I do web, AWS, GCP, external networks, a lot of different stuff.
That's an interesting journey. Hopefully, we'll be able to get into some of those today. Before we start, we generally ask this question to all of our guests, and we get unique answers. And the question is, what does a day in your life look like?
Yeah, I think my day is probably pretty standard in terms of business. So it's usually 9 to 5 business, but usually it's I wake up right and in the morning checking the email, all the different communications. Like NetSpy has something called the platform, right, which is kind of a software solution that helps communicate with clients. So I always try to make myself available to clients, right? So I'm like checking messages on platforms like that, seeing if there's any questions, any concerns during the test, and having some back and forth there. And then the actual testing is going to be usually dependent on what I'm testing. It might be cloud or external network or web. And actually, even day to day, what I'm doing kind of depends on where I am in the test. Maybe it's more configuration based that day or more manual based that day. But that's pretty much it. Obviously the meetings that pop up as well in that 8 hour day, and then kind of finishing out the day and yeah, just trying to do research stuff usually after work. GCPwn is like a tool I've been chipping away at, and then just gaming and all the relaxing stuff after work.
Nice. So let's get into it, right? So today we are going to focus on pen testing, how to get started, tools available for cloud pen testing as well. To kick off, like this year at Forward CloudSec, you open sourced a tool called GCPwn, right? GCPwn.
Yeah.
The idea is that it helps security practitioners, especially like pen testers, to pen test GCP environments. And we want to know a little bit about it. So What does the tool do? And before you answer that, uh, did I say the name correctly? If you want to correct me, please
No,
please do that.
I think I pronounced it GCPwn.
GCPwn. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, the tool, I really try to model it like Pacu, which, if you're familiar, is a pen testing tool for AWS, which is very
Right.
modular based. So usually
Mm-hmm.
you load in credentials and then you will launch a module to enumerate something or exploit something. And it's really nice because all your credentials are in that platform. And so I kept coming back to GCP over the years where I would find GCP creds, right, or something like that. And I would always just Google GCP tools like Pacu. I could never
Mm-hmm.
really find anything. So
Okay.
I needed to learn GCP anyways this last year, so I just figured I'd try to make a tool like that. So the tool itself is kind of, I try to think of it like a Swiss Army knife for GCP pen testing. So it does enumeration and exploit stuff. So by
Mm-hmm.
enumerate, I mean it will enumerate resources in the GCP account and also download the data.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, it will enumerate all the GCP buckets and download all the data in the buckets, right, to a local file. If you want to sift through all the data that's in those buckets, it
Mm-hmm.
also does like exploit stuff. So rather than having to make 3 or 4 separate API calls, it kind of bundles those all together in a module that you
Into
can just
one.
launch and then it
Mm-hmm.
runs. And then the coolest thing I think about it is like the credentials management. So you can have, 4 service account creds, 2 OAuth creds, and an email password, and you can load them all into the tool at once and then kind of swap between them as needed
Oh,
to run the
nice.
modules. And the permissions, because usually when you're doing pen testing and you find credentials, your first question is like, what permissions do these credentials have,
Right.
and what can
Right.
they access? Yeah. So the tool is really meant for if you find credentials in the wild or during a pen test, right, as part of a responsible disclosure policy or whatever, and you want
Mm-hmm.
to decide what permissions these credentials have, you can load them into the tool and start firing off some modules, and in the background, it will passively track what permissions those credentials have, and then kind of
Mm-hmm.
give you a summary. So there's some fun stuff in there. Like I talked about at DEF CON briefly how you can put in credentials, and then because of this API called test IAM permissions, you
Mm-hmm.
can brute force like 99,500 permissions on credentials to the tool, so you can like figure out exactly what permissions you have in some cases. So it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely helpful from a pen testing perspective, where it's you find credentials and you just need to know what the permissions are there.
Hmm. So, you use the term passively once or twice. So, I'm just curious, like, do you see this as an active pen testing tool or a passive pen testing tool? Or
Oh,
maybe for our audience, can you highlight
yeah.
what's the difference between both of them?
Right. So passively, I probably should have used different vocab there. So it's actively sending API calls. So it's actively
Mm-hmm.
working with the cloud environment. By passively,
Mm-hmm.
what I mean is as you're running modules, so as you're calling TCP APIs, it is in the background is probably a better term. Like in the background, it's
Ah,
collecting all the
okay.
API calls you successfully called. And then
Mm-hmm.
so if you call enum buckets and you're able to list all the buckets, then in the background it's saying, "Oh, Scott can list all the buckets. Let me make a note of that." And so at a
Mm-hmm.
later time, you can check all your credentials and it'll be there. So that's kind of in the background as you're running all these modules as things are successfully working. It's making notes of everything that's successfully working, so you kind of get a summary at the end.
That
Yeah.
that makes sense because when it comes to pen testing, you have active and passive as well, right? So now the question is, how do you envision users using this open source tool?
Yeah, so when I made it, I try to make it more like a. I envision it more as a pen testing tool of like a starting point for enumeration and lateral movement, but not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily a configuration review of the entire account, right? You can
Hmm.
run it on the entire account, that's entirely possible. But you might see potentially some performance issues if that account is really big. So the goal
Mm-hmm.
here is more, and again, the way I envision it is you're on a pen test, WAPen, in pen, external network, whatever you're doing, you come across either an email password, GCP credentials, you get an OAuth token, something that gives you a foothold into that GCP environment, and then you load it into the tool, and then you fire off a bunch of modules to see what permissions you have and what data you can get to. And if I'm hoping to add some configuration check stuff in the future, but at the moment, it's not meant to like replace Scout Suite, for example, right, or something like that. It's
Hmm.
not trying to check every configuration thing at the account level. But I
Okay.
mean, it does handle different projects. So like permissions wise, for example, if it can reach multiple projects, it will try to handle like inheritance and permissions, right, and things like that. So it
Mm.
can do multi-project stuff, just not really. I didn't really envision it as like a config checker for everything.
Yeah, yeah, understandable. So, you spoke about one scenario, right? Like misconfig may not be the best use case for the tool. Are there any other scenarios where you don't see your tool being a good fit?
Kind of, yeah, like what I was saying, configuration based. Other than that, okay, so configuration based, and the thing about these pen testing tools is they don't cover every service, right? GCP
Mm-hmm.
has tons of services, and there's also turnover in those services where
Yeah.
some services will go away and some will show up. So
Mm-hmm.
um, it's you might run into a case where you get credentials and the permissions are for APIs that are not rolled into the tool. That being said, what I will say though is because the tool allows you to brute force those permissions, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like I said, you can brute force 9,500 permissions in some cases. Even if the API isn't built into GCPwn, you can still load the credentials in and try to enumerate the permissions at least. And so
Mm-hmm.
once you have the permissions, GCPwn will usually give you back the OAuth 2 token if you want. So like the way I envision it happening is I find, I don't know, creds and they work for what's the GCP service that's not covered? Like memory cache, right? Or Redis or
Mm-hmm.
something. You find the creds and they work for something like that. Memory cache and Redis and that type of stuff isn't built into GCPwn at the moment, but you can still load the credentials in, fire off the permission enumeration, and at the end it will tell you, hey, these credentials work for memory cache and Redis. Here's an OAuth 2 token, and then you can take that info and go to the GCP documentation and call the APIs and all that. So
Okay.
I think that'd be the only other limitation, which is for most tools, right? Like there's so
Mm-hmm.
many cloud services, usually they can't cover all of them.
Yeah, it's difficult to stay up to date, right? Like as you highlighted, like some services are going away, some are getting added. Especially with AI, there are like new services getting rolled out every single day. So yeah, totally understandable. We touched on what areas maybe should not be used today. For any areas that you have in your roadmap that you do
Yeah.
not support today, but you wish to support in future.
So one of them is a wiki. One of the goals of making this tool is to make it community driven and allow people
Mm-hmm.
who want to get into GCPwn or know about GCPwn to add modules. So I'm trying to write a wiki article about how to make pull requests right and add your own modules and own services to the tool. And that
Mm-hmm.
is halfway written somewhere on this desktop, but it's in progress. And the goal is to roll that out this week or next week so that people can also start making pull requests and add their own services. And then in terms of services, I think next on the roadmap I had Cloud Run, Firebase, or yeah, Fire. I always get the terminology mixed up. There's like Firebase and Fire Storage, or the Fire
Firestore.
ones. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and adding those, and then I've been looking at Redis, adding some of the Redis memory cache stuff recently. So those are kind of the services, and then a lot of bug fixes and just fine tuning things,
Mm-hmm.
making it more streamlined, and then yeah, Wiki to help make it more community driven and help people be able to add pull requests and add their own code.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Folks contributing and growing the tool, right? So we reached out to Daniel, and he had a question which is somewhat related to what you're doing, right? Like there is a tool called AWS Pwn, and uh, if in my mind, like both of these should do similar activity, right? How do you feel things have changed since 2016 when it comes to AWS Pwn?
Yeah, so I graduated. Well, I was just starting college in 2016, so I didn't have a ton of experience in the
Mm-hmm.
cloud world, so it's hard for me to gauge how things have changed. I will say though, like even in recent years, you've seen a large number of services. I would say to me, cloud environments grow big. They don't necessarily get more complex; they just get bigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's usually more services being added, more things being added, more, and even if it's a different feature, it's just a different feature. It's not, and so it's more approachable, right, to the average
Mm-hmm.
developer to build those things. I think as cloud environments have grown, there's a greater need, or it's usually a good idea to build a tool such that it's generalized enough it can handle that growth, right? So like for
Mm-hmm.
GCPwn, kind of going back to that, one of the things I did was that enumerating 9,500 permissions, because even though I don't have every service in that tool, I want to build it in such a way that you could still walk away with knowing what permissions give you access to what resources. Even as GCP grows, I can just manually add those permissions. So
Right.
I would like again. I started college in 2016, and I wasn't doing security at the time, so I can't give you a great roadmap for the last 8 years in cloud. But just in recent years, it seems like as services get added, and you see these new trends like AI and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily things are getting way more complex. It's getting wider, and there's more services, and things are getting bigger, and so you have to build tools in such a way to accommodate that growth.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So since we have been speaking about cloud, right? So if I want to start doing cloud pen testing, one of the things that I need to know is some of the basic concepts of cloud, right? And when you go into any cloud, whether it's AWS, GCP, or Azure, they all have a shared responsibility model, which is documented for everyone. Can you briefly describe what that is and how does that work?
Yeah, so the shared responsibility model in cloud is basically like an agreement between you and the cloud provider that says the cloud provider will handle things that are outside of your control as a customer.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you were to deploy an EC, well, if you were to run a Lambda function, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which in AWS, that's like you write a bunch of code, you put it in a text box, and you click the run button, right? You're
Right.
not managing the server that's running that Lambda code. You're not managing the physical box that's sitting in some room somewhere, right? That's running your code. AWS has said they'll manage that. They'll manage the uptime and that kind of stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
then so that's their kind of responsibility to make a functionality work. But then on the flip side, you also have the customer responsibility of making functionality work where again, AWS, GCP, Azure, they give you a lot of freedom in being able to set things up. It's kind of like a sandbox of how you want to build it. And
Mm-hmm.
so with that freedom, inevitably you can set things up that just are inherently secure. And the cloud providers can't really do anything about that. That's kind of a bit on you because you're the one setting it up, right? You're the one
Right.
building it. You're the one who, if you make a Lambda function that dumps all the secrets and you make it open to everyone and you expose it, right? Like the cloud provider can't really do much at that point. They can give you guidelines and suggestions per their documentation. And so that's kind of the shared responsibility is the cloud provider has the responsibility to maintain the things you can't control and keep the uptime and manage the physical infrastructure and that kind of stuff. But you also have the responsibility to build things in a secure way or architect things in a secure way in those sandboxes they give you, depending on whatever service it is.
I like your example of Lambda, right? Often when it comes to Lambda, we think that, yeah, it's all, I just send the code and the cloud provider takes care of everything. But that doesn't mean that if you write very insecure code, it's cloud provider's responsibility.
And you see interesting things in both part of that shared model, right? Where like when I was going through college, it was like, oh, okay, so the cloud provider, there's never going to be a fault there, right? It's always going to be the customer. And so you see there's faults on both sides of that shared model where obviously,
Right.
like we said, a customer could set up things in an insecure way. But if you also follow Forward CloudSec and some of these cloud blogs, you'll notice
Mm.
that cloud providers, those things also pop up insecurely because again at the end of the day cloud providers are companies are humans, right? Humans write things, we all bugs pop up inevitably. So
Yeah.
obviously a lot less frequently than like the customer portion, but
Hmm.
security is an important part of that shared model. So not only do you have that aspect of setting things up securely, but from the cloud provider side they also have to handle security,
Right.
set
Yeah.
that up. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, even though the number of issues that we notice is less, but still, it's not a perfect system, right? Like when it comes to the cloud providers. Now, a follow up question to that is, as a pen tester, uh, mm, each cloud provider provides very similar capabilities, right? With very different catchy names. Like Azure says calls it functions, AWS calls it Lambda, Google calls it functions, right? Similarly for different capabilities. So, as a pen tester, when I am looking into these cloud providers, what are some key security considerations that I should be aware of?
Yeah, a lot of this it's interesting because cloud is usually a jumble or like a what's the word, like a just like a pot of different security skills, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
because if you think about like EC2, you've got IP management, and then you could run a website on EC2. So now you have the website testing, or
Mm-hmm.
like Lambda, we were talking about secure code review. So in terms of core security skills, I there's usually different aspects depending on what you're testing. From a core security perspective, probably networking is the most important because most of the time when you're setting up a cloud environment, you want to make sure that what you're setting up is exposed as you expect, right? If you set up an internal private website and the expectation is only internal employees are going to use that, and then you expose that to an external IP address, and that kind of defeats the whole purpose and might be a risk. So I think networking, especially as you're setting up networks and EC2 instances and doing all these IPs and that kind of stuff, is probably the most important. But then, yeah, like I said, there's the other aspects of like websites, for example. If you have an EC2 instance and you've got a website exposed, and someone can get SSRF on that website,
Hmm.
right, and get into your cloud environment. So you also have to consider the web aspect, and we're ignoring kind of the networking portion and just focusing on the cloud layer.
Right.
I don't. I think access control is a big one. IAM, which I think we'll touch on later, so that's like a big one, but that's kind of cloud specific, and so usually
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be dependent on whatever cloud provider. So that would be a core security skill I would say to learn. But a lot of the security skills I find for the different services are usually dependent on the service, and it's less about learning the core security skill before the test and being able to learn it on the job or pick it up as you go, right?
Hmm.
So, like if you've never seen Lambda before and and you have a lot of core security skills learned before that, if you're on a CPen and you start looking at Lambda and you pull up the AWS documentation, right, you can see, okay, I put code in here, I hit run. Oh, there's an external URL. You can start kind of putting the pieces together and start
Right.
seeing, okay, there's some things that could go wrong here. And so it's really the
Mm-hmm.
misconfig service by service, and you less of a technical skill and more of that soft skill of being able to pick things up, being able to Google things, being able to, you
Connect
know,
the dots.
right, connect the dots and kind of pick it up as you go.
Makes sense. So now, when it comes to pen test, right? I have one more question around it, which is many organizations perform annually or quarterly, like internal or external pen testing, and they get certifications like SOC 2s or HIPAAs or PCIs in order to stay compliant. Now, based on your experience, is that enough?
Yeah, so my experience is usually doing just a general pen test, right? That's because a lot of those certifications might say you need to do a pen test per
Mm-hmm.
year or something like that. So that's kind of where my experience lies. So I think the short answer would be no, but it's a good start. Just because personally, I think that the minimum for your security practice, or the minimum that you consider to be good enough for security, should be higher than that's dictated by external regulations, right?
Hmm.
So if there's a certification that says you need to hit these minimums, that's great, and that's again a great start if you're just starting a security program, or you're just kind of ramping that up. But I think your minimum in terms of standards should be a bit higher than that, just to ensure that you're both protecting your assets and kind of serving your customers at the same time. That being said, like I said, I don't want to like discourage a company,
Mm-hmm.
or organization that's just getting a security program off the ground either, right? I don't want to say it's like bad if you're doing the certification test. Again, it's great. It's better than nothing, than doing nothing. And I'm not trying to like sell you pen tests for the sake of doing pen tests,
Right.
but yeah, there's also that like fiscal. I'm not a finance person, so I understand there's usually budget constraints, right, as well. So you have to kind of prioritize what you test.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I'm a security guy, so I would love to test everything. But
Yeah.
in terms of like what areas should an org pay attention to, or let's say you're doing those annual pen tests, and like where do I go from there, right? Like how do I grow my security program from that? Um, I think one of the big things is if you're only doing a pen test once per year, it might be worth considering more of a continuous pen testing model throughout the
Hmm.
year.
Hmm.
Just because if you do that snapshot pen test, right? If you do a snapshot pen test in June, and then you're all signed off, everything's great, and then in July, one of your developers accidentally, publishes an API key, right, to an exposed
Mm-hmm.
file on a website, you have to wait a whole nother year potentially, once you
Right.
figure that out, or sooner if someone else finds it, right? So in those cases, it's usually good to have more of a continuous model. There's things that are like attack surface management. So, like for example, NetSpy, the company I work for, offers attack surface management (ASM). That or there's other solutions too that are provided by other vendors, and they can like hook into the cloud environments as well. So having some type of continuous model, I think for cloud it's CSPM, right? Cloud
Hmm.
Security Posture Management. Having those types of continuous models, I think, is almost a next natural stepping stone from those
Hmm.
certifications, because you're basically taking that snapshot and applying it over the whole year, and that
Right.
helps both you because you're not getting flooded with vulnerabilities all at once potentially, right? And it helps just make your overall network more secure. And then once you build out that continuous model, you can start looking at more granular tests. So, for
Hmm.
example, maybe you need to test certain websites as dictated by HIPAA or SOC or some of these other certifications. Well, if you
Right.
can build your security program up enough, you can start including some other websites, right? So like websites, mobile apps, some of these other things you can start including into the your overall pen testing strategy.
Hmm.
And I think that helps. And CPens, right? So CPens is another one where um, probably you want to focus on externally facing assets right first with web applications, but kind of the next step there, at least in again my opinion, is once you're looking at those external assets and you've kind of cleared all of those, then you want to look at the cloud environment because usually it's a good
Hmm.
idea from a web perspective. The web is good to look at if you're worried about someone from an external perspective, right, messing with your website. And cloud pen
Right.
tests are really good for that perspective of, well, what if someone compromises a website or mobile or whatever and gets into my cloud environment? So it's kind of like the next layer
Hmm.
naturally, and it also helps find kind of publicly identifiable resources and that stuff. And then kind of at the very end of this, I think that the final step is just kind of red teaming, right? If you have security
Hmm.
controls in place and you have a continuous model and you're doing these granular tests, the next question is not necessarily do you have vulnerabilities, but can you catch someone trying to exploit your vulnerabilities in real
Right.
time? And so that's when
Right.
I think you get into the red team. So that's kind of my long answer for that question is yes, I think it's no, I don't think it's enough. I think we should be striving for kind of a higher standard in terms of minimum. I
Hmm.
understand there's budget constraints as well though, so kind of in your own time, whatever works best for your organization, I think it's worth kind of looking at better opportunities or more opportunities for testing your assets and kind of just building your team overall.
The takeaway, at least for me, is the closer you are to doing continuous pen testing, the better. That
Right.
doesn't mean that if you are not able to do, it's completely wrong. You need to have at least those annual or quarterly pen tests if you can do those. At least
Yep.
those give you a snapshot at that point, and then you have to think about how do you handle the deltas after that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it makes sense. One of the things that you highlighted is misconfigurations, right? Is often the root of like security mishaps. It can be an internal or an external configuration challenge. So, as a pen tester, what are some of the common misconfigurations that you typically look at?
Yeah. So there's a couple different areas usually. So I mean, there are certain things that are very configuration based per service, and what I mean by that is it's usually a setting or a flag or a checkbox, right?
Hmm.
That you need to make sure your data is encrypted, that kind of stuff. And so tools like Scout Suite, those types of tools that do kind of those organization wide checks are usually good at checking for those kinds of things.
Right.
Again, another example, like do you have IMDS version 2 enabled and IMDS
Hmm.
version 1 disabled, right? Those are the kind of config checks that kind of fit into that category. As
Right.
part of the configuration review, I'm also looking for secrets in publicly available resources or clear text creds that are stored where they should be placed in the cloud provider's corresponding secrets manager. Some of
Hmm.
those are pretty fun. Some of these are self-explanatory, like don't put your secrets in Lambda source code, right? Like that's a pretty static thing. But there's also other ones that I find kind of interesting. And one, like for example, I look at
Hmm.
that might not get as much attention as CloudWatch, right? So thinking about
Yeah.
secrets and like static files, oh, Lambda source code, you upload it, it's probably going to stay that way for several months. So it's a
Mm-hmm.
pretty static thing to check for. But your CloudWatch logs, depending on what you're building, what services you're using, those are always changing. They can evolve over time. They're totally at the discretion of the developer, whatever they want to
Mm-hmm.
pronounce. So I always have fun looking at CloudWatch logs as part of CPens. In fact, like Pacu, for example, that tool that does pen testing for AWS has a module specifically for just downloading CloudWatch logs.
Oh, wow.
So I think it's 24 hours worth. It'll just try to download all the logs. So that's
Mm-hmm.
definitely like an avenue I check for. And then obviously you can't talk about misconfigurations without IAM. So misconfigured permissive IAM permissions are something I always look for. I always look for things that have star or wildcard in any of permissions. If you're
Yes.
not familiar with that in cloud, that usually means either you can access every resource and every action. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they have their they have their uses based off their business use case. So just because you have a star in your policy doesn't automatically mean I'm going to write something up, right? But
Yeah.
usually, at least what I personally recommend is even if you have stars, it's better to list out, like let's say you do S3 star, right?
Mm-hmm.
So basically you're allowed to do every S3 action.
Right.
Usually, I personally recommend it's better to just list out every S3 action
Mm-hmm.
because what you'll find is that when you're listing out every action that the user is allowed to use,
Mm-hmm.
inevitably you'll run into an action that doesn't make sense for the user to have, right? If there's like 20 S3 APIs, there's probably one or two that the user doesn't really need. And so
Yeah.
even just that granular change of one or two actions still decreases your overall attack surface area.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I usually recommend if you ever see a star in your policy, just see if you can swap that out with literally, even if it's like 20 APIs, literally the specific actions, and that gives you a much better, more granular look at how everything's working. Then obviously config checks, you have like your network specific checks, kind of like what we were talking to earlier. So are you exposing things that you are only meant for internal to the external? Just your network security overall. If you have like external assets that are vulnerable versions of things, right, or deprecated OSs or deprecated versions of things, things of that nature. And then finally, I usually kind of at the very end of all this, I like to do a manual, kind of what I talked about earlier. I do a manual check on the individual services and really try to
Right.
deep dive to find the specific edge cases or unique things about those services.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's usually important because from a config check perspective, configuration checks are great, but they lack that human element, and so they'll miss things sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, uh, you know, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but like for example, Cognito, right? Cognito. There was a talk at Black Hat in 2019, I believe, about Cognito identities, and these researchers went out and found a bunch of Cognito endpoints and were able to authenticate to the unauthenticated role that you can set up in
Oh.
Cognito, right, at like a mass scale, internet scale.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, I don't know off the top of my head if that's something like Scout Suite would check or
Mm-hmm.
some of these other tools. But like if you have an unauthenticated role, right, that's exposed, then if the permission or the role attached to that unauthenticated perspective is scoped down enough, it might still
Mm-hmm.
be dangerous, right? Like if you attach a role that says, "Hey, any anonymous user can pull all my Lambda code," from
Right.
a Scout Suite perspective and from a config perspective, that might make sense and that might
Mm-hmm.
be fine because it's very granular. But from like the human element looking at it, you might be like, why are you allowing everyone to download your Lambda code, right?
Right. Right.
So usually that's kind of the stuff I look for in that human element is just if things don't make sense.
And imagine, like I love the example that you gave, right? Like instead of giving star permissions, reducing it to just writing it down, whatever permissions you want to allow, whatever APIs you want to allow. It like it sounds tedious, right? When you are setting it up for someone, I have to go look for all the permissions, which one is needed, not like it might take more brain power than I want to spend, but in longer run, it certainly helps. And
Yeah,
again, the example that you gave, right, Lambda, if you have scoped it down just to read, so even if someone got access to your code, they could download the code, but they cannot change your Lambda functions and run their own code or something like that, right? Like do
yeah,
lateral movements and things like that. So it's, again, as you said, it's not the perfect solution, but at least it reduces the attack surface quite a bit if you go through the API actions available and replace it with like replace stars with specific API actions.
Yeah, same with resources too, right?
Yeah.
If you have actions for S3 and that S3 or Lambda or whatever, and your service is only accessing one S3 or one Lambda function, like you don't
Hmm.
need to put star to give them access to everything. Just list
Right.
that those two or three or whatever Lambda functions and buckets, and you've drastically reduced your attack surface again. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you mentioned about Scout Suite, which is an amazing tool. Any other tools that comes to your mind? Any specific to any particular cloud providers, or you would recommend folks to start with maybe Scout Suite?
Yeah, it really depends. I think Scout Suite is a good beginner tool when you're just starting to learn the cloud environments because you can, and kind of, I think I'll touch on this later, but you can, a lot of these cloud providers let you make accounts for free, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really nice when you're learning something, you can actually put it into practice in your own account. So if
Mm-hmm.
you learn about, hey, AWS IMDS version 1 versus version 2, and you read all about that, and you're like, I want to see what this looks like, and you make an AWS account and you actually set that up and
Mm-hmm.
delete the EC2 so you don't incur charges at the end of the month.
Right.
But if you
Right.
check that out and you run, then you can run Scout Suite on it and kind of see what that looks like from Scout Suite's perspective. So it's a good kind of like closing the loop of learning those things. In
Right.
terms of like general tools, so Scout Suite is great for configuration. Pacu and GCPwn are pretty good if you're doing um, not necessarily maybe a cloud config check, but if you're on another service line, so web application or something like that nature, and you want to figure out how to pivot in the cloud, those are good tools where you start out with credentials that are
Mm-hmm.
unknown and you have to go from there. Um, Again, kind of like what I mentioned before, cloud automated tools sometimes will miss things, and a lot of it is
Mm-hmm.
very context dependent. So I would probably focus less on a tool itself and more about understanding the service, kind of like the Cognito example I gave.
Right. Right.
So yeah, it was Black Hat USA 2019 where they just went out and found all these unauthenticated identities. So again, like a config check might not necessarily find that, and so just understanding each service because you have the UI, right? It's not like you have to do
Mm-hmm.
this all from the API level. Usually, if you're doing a cloud config check, you usually have a web browser. You can just click all the buttons, right, and see everything. So it's more about like understanding the service in order to test it. And then there's some other cool tools in terms of like learning the cloud providers. Like there's a lot of different open source projects about setting up a vulnerable cloud environment, kind of like testing it, like Cloud Foxable. It's made by
Yes.
like Seth Art, right, or and some other
Mm-hmm.
contributors. That's like a great learning platform I've heard for kind of like learning AWS, and I think I'll touch on some of those at the end as well. But that's there's definitely a large amount of tools. I would
Mm-hmm.
say the most important thing at the end of the day, though, is understanding the service and the nuance of the service, because from a value perspective in doing testing, it's a lot more valuable, in my opinion, to
Mm-hmm.
present a finding that would not normally be caught by a configuration scan or one of those tools, just based
Mm-hmm.
off that context and human element.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, but that's kind of my long-winded answer there.
Like, I love the details that you added, right? So a follow-up question to that is that now let's say I know, I have a little bit of understanding of cloud. I have a little bit of understanding of tools like Scout Suite or Faku or GCPwn. uh, Now I want to start, and there are these three major providers: AWS, Azure, and GCP. Which platform should I do you recommend generally for beginners to focus, or do
Yeah,
you suggest going across all of them?
I would probably focus on one instead of going
Mm-hmm.
across all of them. At least that's. I think it also depends on how you learn. I don't think there's like a uh, one like plan fits all or solution fits
Right.
all. It kind of, so like for me personally, it's also the same with the cloud providers. For me personally, I start on AWS. So to
Mm.
me, AWS is like the most intuitive, easy to learn, no problem. So jumping from that to GCP was like pretty pretty interesting. There was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
different ways I had to kind of rethink things. But at the same time, I know people who started with Azure, right, and who have
Mm-hmm.
done Azure stuff for years and say Azure is way simpler than AWS.
Hmm.
So it kind of depends. For me personally, I will usually recommend AWS, but I'll also say it's usually a good idea, or I usually advise learning the cloud provider your company is using because that helps a lot, right?
Right.
If you just ask around at your company and you're using Azure,
Hmm.
probably just learn Azure because at least for me, when you're learning those types of cloud providers and you learn features for that cloud provider, you can
Hmm.
ask people, at your work or just say, hey, I learned about this. What does that look like in practice? And because your
Yeah.
company is using it, your org is using it, you're able to kind of see that firsthand and see that in practice. And so, again, for me, that's just a much better way to learn and a much better way for me to kind of connect the dots. I'm like, for consulting, right? It's doing those tests over and over. It's helps me kind of learn a concept and then actually see it on an engagement, right? And then kind of close that loop of reinforcing it. But so
Hmm.
that would be my advice: is really, I don't think it matters which one you start with. Personally, I always lean towards AWS. But
Hmm.
whatever you do decide to go with, I would just stick with that one and kind of like learn the core concepts and then see if you can't align it with what you do in your day to day to kind of reinforce that concepts and pick things up.
Yeah, I love your suggestion of learning or starting with the environment that your organization uses so that you have others who have been working in that same cloud environment. They can guide you if you are making some mistake, and also you're getting a sandbox,
Yeah.
right? You would always have a dev or a QA where you can like figure things out, even from a pen testing perspective. So yeah, that's a very good suggestion. uh, so earlier we touched on this, that you mentioned there are many areas, right? Networking, IAM, your server setup, like many areas when it comes to
Yeah.
pen testing. As a beginner, is there one area that I should pick?
I always recommend IAM because almost everything in all the cloud providers is
Hmm.
sitting on IAM. So usually, and the reason for that is usually IAM. If you can really master IAM and the different how different users are defined, how you get the credentials, how you set up policies to dictate who can access what, then you're in
Hmm.
a really good place. And it's actually way easier, at least for me, to learn the other services. Because at the end of the day, like S3, Google Cloud Storage, right, these different services, they're usually just functionality, right? Like Google Cloud
Hmm.
Storage, you upload things to a bucket.
Right.
It's not that
Right.
it's like obviously there's complexity on top of that. You can put additional stuff on there, but at its base, it's pretty easy to understand. And so where a lot of the
Hmm.
confusion comes from, and where I think people sometimes get tripped up, is once you put something in that bucket, trying to figure out okay who's allowed to access that, and like is my bucket public, right, or how are my permissions set up? So in my mind, learning IAM and learning all those permissions makes it really easy to pick up the other services because once you get to those other services, you really just have to understand the core functionality and everything else kind of just clicks into place because it's all just the same IAM. Or like
Yeah.
Lambda, right? If you set up a Lambda uh, and you don't know IAM, it's probably a lot more daunting. Whereas if you do know IAM, it's like, okay, Lambda, you like put code in a box and you click run, right? And
Hmm.
now the IAM part is, okay, who's allowed to access Lambda and what permissions does the Lambda have when it's running? And if you understand IAM, you can answer those two questions pretty easily and you're set. That's usually what
And
I do.
often folks who move from like traditional data centers to cloud, that's one of the biggest change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because earlier, in case of running an on-prem data center, it's all driven through AD or something like that, which has limited sort of blast radius. You focus more on the network side, but the moment when you move to cloud, uh, I am like, it hits you, right? You have to understand how it works throughout the provider services, how how the services authenticate and things like that. So yeah, that's a very good suggestion that we should start with IAM. Uh, so mm, let's say I understand the value of pen testing, I understand the cloud a little bit, and I want to get started. So there are tons of resources available online. Do you have any suggestions, like any free or affordable online courses or something like that, so that yeah, I can learn from it there and then get my hands dirty?
Yeah, there's some I personally use, right, and can like personally point to, right? I don't have any. I
Hmm.
don't think I have any that are quote like recommended by NetSpy, right? But there are some that I can point to. So
Sure.
like Pwn Labs is one of them, for example, that I think has popped up recently. I know I did a couple of the free labs for when I was working on GCPwn.
Mm-hmm.
So Pwn Labs is really cool because it's kind of like a lot of people are probably familiar with Hack the Box, which
Mm-hmm.
is basically like a sandbox where you'll deploy a web server, an IP, something, and then you try to hack it in kind of a controlled environment, right? So it simulates that. I don't think there's a ton for like cloud resources in terms of launching those boxes. So
Mm-hmm.
Prone Labs is nice because it's like hack. It seems like Hack the Box, but specifically for cloud. So you like launch a room, right, and it launches a cloud environment for you, and then oh, you found exposed creds. What do you do with these? And so it kind of walks you through that. So that's pretty good. Cloud Foxable is definitely something I would check out. I've heard a lot about it. It's definitely on my to-do list to uh, go through it because it looks really fun. It's like a Jeopardy CTF style learning. So
Yes.
if you really like the challenges and like reaching the end of an obstacle and getting a flag, that seems really cool. I know that's Seth Art has contributed to that and spoke on that over at Datadog. He spoke on that at DEF CON, and that's also just open source, right? And I
Right.
think we have a whole blog article somewhere that kind of details how to set that up and walk through that. Hacking the
Mm-hmm.
Cloud by Nick. So once those are kind of like tools to learn it, and then a big part of cloud learning, I think, is just reading blog articles, reading blog articles and replicating it in your own environment. So like hacking the cloud by Nick Frechette, again over at Datadog, is a great resource that has kind of a bunch of different articles on different exploits and that kind of stuff. So usually what I
Right.
recommend when learning the cloud provider, like what I did to learn GCP, is again, a lot of these cloud providers just let you make a free account.
Mm-hmm.
So I just made like a free account, and then I might learn about GCP cloud storage, right? Like I'll read a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
stuff about it, and then I can go to my cloud environment and actually make a bucket and like physically click those buttons and kind of connect the dots. So that's what I usually recommend is learning the cloud, kind of going service by service and having your
Mm-hmm.
own test environment to just learn things. Now that being said, it's probably a good idea if you're making a test environment to like maybe segment it from your right like primary email and all that. Maybe do a little work to set up a cloud environment such that it's segmented from your other stuff, right? Because you don't want to like be playing around in a cloud environment and testing things and then that actually does get compromised. So
Yeah.
usually
Yeah.
I make a cloud environment to test things, and I make it segmented enough that it's not really attached to any of my stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll kind of play around in that and test specific things. And once, and also if you have your own cloud environment, you can start learning the APIs. Right? If you
Mm-hmm.
have your own cloud environment, you can look at Boto 3 for AWS or like the GCP by Python SDKs, and you could just like write a simple function to list all the buckets in your
Mm-hmm.
own account. And it's kind of doing things like that that help pick things up. Because cloud is very much like if you can understand the core concepts, then a lot of it translates service by service. So I think you'll find like as you're learning cloud, as you pick things up, you kind of almost go faster and faster because you kind of have a better template or a foundation to build on.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to ask you about how to set up a secure lab and things like that. One key thing that you highlighted is if you're setting up a cloud environment, make sure that is not connected to maybe your production workload. It's very segregated so that even if you get compromised, that is very limited to maybe your test cloud environment. Any other recommendations you have from a
Yeah.
lab setup for my pen testing?
Yeah, lab setup. I usually do lab setup like just a personal account, right? I'm not trying to tie it into any organization.
Hmm.
So, like, I wouldn't like deploy like a development account and then just start deploying a bunch of random stuff, right? In my actual production or company cloud environment, I would probably do again, this is just for personal learning, so there shouldn't be any company data in there. So
Mm-hmm.
I would usually I'll just set up my own environment, like a personal environment.
Hmm.
So like Google, you need like a Gmail. AWS, you need a Gmail. But again, I try to set those up as pretty standalone, pretty segmented. And then usually, if you're setting up your own lab environment to test things, just make sure to tear things down at the end, right? Don't leave
Yeah.
stuff up. If you and also just like common sense. If you want to test public S3 buckets that are open to the world, I mean that's something you can test, but like don't put your social security number in there, right? Or like don't put actual passwords in there. Just you like expect someone will exploit whatever you're setting up in your cloud environment. So just set it up in such a way that, if you do expose an S3 bucket to the world just to see what that looks like, maybe it's just a document that says test in it, right? Like it's
Right, right.
right, nothing that's actually could result in vulnerabilities. And especially the cloud, if you're going to learn cloud and set up your own lab environment, it's usually a good idea to just again do a personal lab environment. Don't put company
Hmm.
resources in there. Just keep it totally segmented just for your own personal learning.
That's a great advice. Uh, just to stay safe, right? Like since you are learning, you may not have figured out many things. It's better to have a segregated environment so that it doesn't impact your production. Make sure you tear it down once your
Yeah,
testing is done.
yeah.
If
Or
you
you'll
leave things around, then you will get hacked
or yeah,
eventually.
or you'll get a bill, which I've
Yeah.
done that.
Oh
You'll
yeah,
get a
yeah.
bill at the end of the month. So
True,
that
true.
is yeah.
So this is slightly off topic, but one of the things that comes with all of this is that you have to learn a lot to stay up to date. You have to experiment with many services that comes from cloud providers, which constantly keeps growing. That could add a lot of stress or burnout, right? One of the key statistics which was presented in Gartner Security Conference this year was that around 73% of CISOs and security leaders feel burnout at some level in their work life. What's your take on this, and how do you handle stress and burnout?
Yeah, it's definitely something that pops up working in consulting because um, usually what I try to do is just like work is work, right? You need that work life balance. So usually I'll try to the general rule of thumb I do is I will try to cut off my workday right at 8 hours or whatever it is because
Hmm.
whatever you're looking at can usually wait till tomorrow.
Hmm.
Um, or if there's something that I'm looking at after business hours, it's usually because I want to look at it, right? Or I
Right.
think it's interesting. So, I do WAPens. If I find an SQL injection or something like that, right? Maybe during that 8 hours of my day, I'm making sure I get everything in there and get the minimum. And
Hmm.
then once that 8 hours is done, right, having that really defined work life balance. Or if I want to kind of chase down that SQL injection and say, because I find that fun, see like, hey, where can I go from here? Then that's something I'll look into. But that's kind of the general strategy I try to do. But it's definitely a work in progress, right? That's definitely something you have to consciously work for and strive for because it's so
Hmm.
easy, definitely in security, to get caught up in that security atmosphere,
Yeah.
right? And 1 hour turns into 2 hours of looking at something and it just kind of exponentially grows. So I think the biggest thing is just being cognizant of it and kind of coming up with a plan or strategy to do what you need to do in the time required. And then kind of like what I said, my strategy is just if I find something really interesting or I want to look at something, then I'm fine doing that after hours. But if that's the case, it's something I want to do and I'm actively choosing to do that.
Yeah. So finding the balance and also finding what sort of motivates you, right? And so that you can keep going in that area. You don't feel burnout because you're learning as part of that process. So you handle that way. Makes a lot of sense. So yeah, that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much, Scott, for the engaging conversation. Here are a few key takeaways. The first one is GCPwn, modeled after Paku, is a great tool for pen testing, covering enumeration and lateral movements. There are many more capabilities coming up soon with support for more services and APIs. The second one is annual pen testing is a good start, but pen testing should be as close to continuous as possible because it helps organizations stay up to date with their attack surface. The last one is when starting to pen test, start with IAM. It connects all other services together and it's the most impactful. And when you are creating environments for your pen test, create a segregated cloud environment and tear it down once it's not used anymore. Thank you. Before I let you go, one last question: do you have any reading recommendation? Like it could be a blog or a book or a podcast.
So a lot of the security companies will have blogs for different cloud providers. So not like one thing to check, but I would probably check a lot of those. So, for example, like NetSpy, for example, Thomas Eiling just published something about Google Groups, right? I've written stuff about AWS organizations. So, and then there's other companies like uh, Huntress, Prismo, right? Is another one.
For me,
There's a
so
lot, yeah,
I
Permiso,
think,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of different companies that have blog articles out about specific cloud things.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's a couple books like I know Carl at NetSpy, who is kind of like a wizard in the Azure space, wrote a book about Azure pen testing. So I only know GCP and AWS, so I can't uh, speak to Azure a whole ton, but I imagine it's a pretty great book since, again, he's like a wizard in Azure stuff. Uh, and so, yes, it's not really hacking the cloud is like one I mentioned, right? But it's less about like just one book or one
Hmm.
blog, and it's really just looking at a lot of different blogs across time, and probably learning the service first. So like if you're learning Cognito, right, in
Hmm.
AWS, learn Cognito, and then once you kind of have a good foundational understanding of Cognito, then start looking up Cognito, um, like hacking blogs and pen testing blogs, and
Right.
you'll find a lot of information, and that information will probably be way more valuable to you than if you just went there from the get go, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
that's what I'd recommend. So not one thing, but many things.
Yeah, like the way, understand many things, but also be able to connect the dots so that you can do better pen testing, right? Better discovery of gaps in the security infrastructure.
Right.
So, yeah, that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much, Scott. It was a fun conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And to our audience, thank you so much for watching. See you in the next episode. Thank you.